Welcome to Racial Solidarity, Building Beyond Barriers. I'm Dr. Carlton E. Green. I'm the Director of Diversity Training and Education here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I am pleased to be joined by three of our esteemed faculty members and thought leaders here on our campus today. I'm going to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit later. I also want to acknowledge and thank the School of Public Health for their support of this program, as well as the Center for Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education for their contributions to this program. Also, just really want to acknowledge my colleagues here in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion who also contribute to this effort. Before we get started, we do want to, with the program, or as we start the program, I want to also lift up this land acknowledgement that has been provided by our Piscataway elders here in this region, as well as the folks over in multicultural involvement and community advocacy, our MICA office. So we thank both of them. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. At the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systemically disenfranchised. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here together today. Thank you for that. I often make reference to the link that you can find, that you can use to find the ancestral lands that you're on, and then I never have the link accessible. Jasmine or Allison, could you all drop that link into the chat for us, please? Before we begin with our panelists, I want to just give a slight framing for why we are here in this conversation today. In the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, we started a series of conversations last semester or last year in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. We wanted to lift up anti-racism as a concept and also as a set of practices and principles for our own campus so that we could more fully engage in anti-racist work. In that series, we invited members of our university community as well as a few Terrapin graduates to participate. We wanted them to share about anti-racism as it pertained to leadership, critical race theory, the campus community, and a host of other topics. If you are interested, you can also go to the ODI YouTube page and you can view those teach-ins. We'd like to continue the series of conversations while also recognizing that we should be addressing all forms of systemic oppression. Today, we start that journey by lifting up solidarity, which our panelists will address. In ODI, we've been having conversations about solidarity work, and we know others across campus have also been doing the same. Today, we want to acknowledge that Dr. Janelle Wong in Asian American Studies and Dr. Jason Nichols of African American Studies have been engaging in conversations about how we can help our students and student organizations act in solidarity together. There will be upcoming programming pertaining to helping our students to dream build when it comes to solidarity, and we'll give you just a little direction about that closer to the end of the program. Solidarity seems particularly salient at this moment. In a country where people who are socially minoritized continue to be targeted, harassed, or terrorized, in a country that's surveilling, dismissing, and suppressing the intellectual labor and creativity of those who are minoritized by race, gender, and sexual orientation, but also on a campus where queer, Jewish, trans, Black, and women students, people more broadly, are constantly reporting harassment, bias, and assault. We need not only be talking about resisting oppression, we have to begin to come together to build coalitions that sustain our work and sustain our efforts for being able to resist. We know that social identity groups are often pitted against each other. Black people versus Asian people, Black people versus Jewish people, trans women versus cis women. bi folks versus lesbian and gay folks, light-skinned people versus dark-skinned people. We also know that this is a function of white supremacy. We know that if white supremacy wins, we all lose, right? And as Toni Morrison says, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says that your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. White supremacy culture keeps us distracted, right? And as long as it's keeping us distracted, it keeps us from being connected. And when it does that, it wins. One of the ways that we saw this occur back in March of this past year was when, in the aftermath of the murders of the Asian women in Atlanta, the news media began to play up that Black people were assaulting Asian folks. But the brilliant work of our colleague Janelle Wong really helped us to understand that that narrative actually just wasn't true. More often than not, white men were the ones who were assaulting and harassing and attacking Asian people. Yet, we saw that narrative play out in the news media over and over and over again. So enough is enough. Let's stop with that narrative and let's talk about how it is that we can build coalitions among our communities. Today, we've invited 3 very gifted scholars, 3 very brilliant minds into this conversation to talk just about that, solidarity, and how it is that we can begin building, how we can think about what that looks like, and what are some of the barriers that we need to be navigating. I want to start this conversation. I'm going to stop I'll do that in just a second. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. But I want to go back to something that we did share with you all from the previous teach-ins. And that's really these definitions of anti-racism and racism as a way of being able to ground ourselves. I've been using the work of Dr. Kamara Jones to really help us think about racism. And she says simply, racism is a system. It's not a personal moral failing. It's not even a psychiatric illness. It's a system of power, and it's a system of doing 2 things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And it does those things based upon so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how we look. And what we know is that people use racism to keep us as communities of color in particular divided. But we also know that that trickles out into other social identity groups as well. When we're talking about anti-racism, we really want to focus on changing our behavior. Anti-racism is behavior. Anti-racism is pursuing racial justice by naming, understanding, being accountable for, and then providing remedies for the system of racial stratification that structures opportunity and assigns value. Now with that, I want to stop sharing these slides and invite our panelists in to introduce themselves. I'm going to start by inviting Dr. William Ming Liu to come in and tell us a little bit about who he is and how he positions himself when it comes to thinking about solidarity work. Will?
Thank you, Carlton. I appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation to participate. My name is William Ming Liu. I use he, him, his, and I am a professor of counseling psychology, also the department chair for counseling, higher ed, and special education. Solidarity work is critical to my daily function with respect to being a professor and also running a department, but also I've experienced running, collaborating in racial solidarity as a process of developing and building the Asian American Studies program at the University of Maryland when I was here as a graduate student. So I'm well aware of the need and the desperation and the importance of racial solidarity to build something for future generations. So I'm really just happy to be here and participating in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I always forget that you were a grad student here. So thank you for that reminder. We will go to Deepa Iyer next.
Thanks so much, Carlton, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Deepa Iyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently an adjunct professor at the School of Public Policy, where I'm teaching a class on social change movements of the 21st century, where we talk a lot about solidarity. And I've also been an adjunct at the Asian American Studies program, so it's good to be among folks who are connected to it. In my day job, I actually work quite often with people who are in nonprofit organizations and in social movements to strengthen their practices of transformative solidarity. and I work at the Building Movement Project. So if you're interested, you can learn more about the work that we do there about solidarity practice. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're so excited to have you as part of this conversation to learn from your practice, right? And Nancy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am so honored to be in conversation with my colleagues, with everyone here. I am an associate professor of American Studies and the U.S. Latino Studies program. I go by she, her, ella, and I'm a historian by training, and much of my work is really about challenging historical narratives of white supremacy and continue to center whiteness. In addition to my work at the university, I'm also on the board for Teaching for Change. I'm part of Scholars for Social Justice. So this is work that I feel is so important into the university, but also that reaches outside of the university as well. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for that, Nancy. So what we're going to do, and the way that we've been having these conversations, that it really is going to be a conversation. I have some questions for our panelists, and I'll try to drop those into the chat, but we've also encouraged them to be in conversation with each other as we have this conversation, right? So our first one is actually, we're going to start with Deepa. Can you start us off by talking to us about this? What is solidarity, and how is it related to anti-racism and anti-oppression work?
Yes, that is a big question. I will see if I can start us off. And I'm going to use a couple of slides just to move us along in that conversation. Carlton, please feel free to stop me if I am going too long. But what I wanted to start off is, oftentimes and Carlton, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides? Okay. So oftentimes, we hear the word solidarity quite a bit, right? It's a buzzword, it's a hashtag, and it oftentimes seems like this big concept that we're trying to reach, but it's difficult to understand what it means in real life. And so I want to start off by saying that solidarity is actually a verb, it's a practice and a strategy. And it has a lot of, there are a lot of reasons, right, why we should practice solidarity. You see some of them on this slide. There are many others. As Carlton said earlier, a big purpose of using solidarity is actually to bring about some sort of systems change. So whether that is around power, equity, inclusion, liberation, what are the policies and legislation or practices or even structures of government that need to shift in order to bring about the equitable, inclusive world that we seek. It's also a strategy that we can use to support cross-community alliances and to catalyze power sharing among different groups. Given that we are seeing this huge racial demographic transformation in this country, it's really important that communities of color are able to work closely together to share power and to actually understand how they can bring about the systems change that they want and the policy demands that they have. And then lastly, it's a practice that we can use to address a lot of the internal racism and the ways in which white supremacy shows up within our communities as well, to prevent us from creating wedges between each other as well. So those are just three ways in which we can utilize solidarity as a practice and a verb. So at the Building Movement Project where I work, we talk a lot about what transformative solidarity is as opposed to transactional solidarity. And transactional solidarity is one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm going to show up at your event if you show up at mine, right? But transformative solidarity actually means that there is, as Carlton mentioned, both a behavior change, right, in the ways that we actually relate to each other, and there is a systems change. And so that's what transformative solidarity leads to. It changes me, it changes you, it changes our communities and the systems in which we operate. So we've identified 6 principles for transformative solidarity practice. I'm not going to go into each of these. You'll see that I was in to the letter C that day when I wrote this up. But the 6 ones that we talk about often are around centering, right? Whom are we centering? Which communities are we centering? How do we find commonalities and build relationships through understanding our histories of oppression and resilience, as Nancy was talking about the importance of history, without flattening or equating our experiences, right? Understanding the similarities, but recognizing that there are unique differences. Co-liberation, this idea that we're working towards our mutual freedom, that we're also going to be guided by an explicit commitment to end anti-Black racism. So when we have any sort of solidarity commitment, one of the first questions that we should ask about is, well, how does that solidarity commitment relate to ending generational anti-Black racism? Co-conspirators, this understanding that many of us carry a lot of privileges and a lot of positionality and power. How are we going to actually utilize those privileges in a way to build support for the demands that are made by affected communities? And then finally, capacity. How do we sustain our ability to deal with conflict, with tension, and to do this work for the long term as an individual or as an organization or an institution? So those are just some ways that we can think about practicing solidarity, so that it isn't just this big, high concept, but that it actually is something that we practice every single day. And then I'll just close with this slide, which I really have always been inspired by, because it's got this, I think is from a couple of years ago, but the University of Maryland Asian American Student Union had this really powerful sign, right? Yellow Peril loves, supports, and protects Black power. And it really identifies, again, both the connections between how Asian Americans have been treated in this country as the perpetual foreigner, as the peril, as terrorists, and so on. And recognizing that white supremacy has also done the same for Black communities, but also recognizing the differences, right? And recognizing that it is really important to show up for Black communities every single time. So I'll pause there, but looking forward to our conversation and learning more from everyone.
Thank you so much for that overview, Deepa. Really, really powerful, and also it gives us some language, right, to be able to talk about solidarity. I'm wondering, Will or Nancy, do you have any sort of like immediate reactions to what it is that Deepa is sharing when it comes to thinking about or talking about solidarity?
I mean, I can go. I thought that the screens that you showed to define what it means was just brilliant. It was amazing. And because oftentimes when we think about solidarity, we think we know what that means. And what you did was that you said, yes, but there is a process to it, right? There is a way that we can work towards it. And I think that is so valuable, because hopefully one of the things that we can do together in conversation is to maybe give some really practical, concrete tools for what that looks like, whether it's in the university or in the community. So I just wanted to thank you for starting the conversation with that, because I think that that really leads to a much more fruitful exchange. And I found it incredibly helpful. So thank you.
I agree. I love the idea that you called it a practice, because I had in my notes that I called it a habit. And I think you have to be in a habit of doing it. The habit of participating, engaging, showing up, but also understanding how to do your own work related to solidarity activism and work altogether. And that own work always is fighting and understanding the effect of white supremacy in your life, how you adhere to it, and also the ways that we engage in anti-Blackness in lots of different ways. And also being attuned to the ways that anti-Blackness shows up in other conversations. And so I think it's really critically important that when we think about solidarity, it's not, as I think you described it, transactional, just showing up to an event, but it's really in those private spaces, in those private moments with other people who think that they can say something or do something that you have. And those are the places where you have to see yourself in solidarity and see yourself as holding a responsibility to the community to which you believe you're aligned with. So I think that's really important. So thank you.
One of the things that stood out to me, Deepa, as you were describing it, was this notion of dealing with the internal, right? and the way it was set up on the slides, I was thinking about sort of like internalized oppression that people might have, but it also seems like you were talking also about the internal dynamics within communities that sometimes need to be addressed. Can you say more about sort of like maybe those two trains of sort of like the internalized dynamics and what that would mean for actually engaging in this work?
Yeah, and thank you so much, Nancy and William, for your responses. I'm glad that the slides were helpful and the framework is useful. I think to pick up on William's point around, we have to actually identify how our internal biases show up, right? I think that is absolutely part and parcel of solidarity practice, to look inward and to recognize as an individual, how have we actually been affected by oppression, but how do we also practice it in many ways? Oftentimes, because we live in a culture of white supremacy, we are taught, right, certain practices around colorism, class, around anti-Blackness. I know, for example, with the communities I often work with South Asian communities, a lot of anti-Blackness starts back home and then it's brought here to the US. It's reinforced by the ways in which the United States perpetuates anti-Black racism. So it's important to actually interrupt. Practice of solidarity includes interrupting those biases, interrupting those misperceptions. And that involves self-knowledge, it involves understanding history, it involves understanding how these systems operate on a daily basis, right? And then so that's the internalized oppression. And then sometimes we then practice it, right? So that's where we actually create wedges between communities. And you see that playing out, for example, when you think about, say, the ways in which oftentimes Asians and Blacks are pitted against each other, where Asian Americans are often seen as quota model minority, right? As like spelling bee champions and Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. And that messaging is, and we know this from the work of so many scholars like Ellen Wu and others, it's a way of, again, pitting Asian Americans against Black communities and sending a message to Black people and Latinx people to say, why can't you be like this community, right? And so we have to understand how those white supremacy has created these wedges that we need to interrupt. We need to dismantle at every turn, which is why I go back to saying that a commitment to ending anti-Black racism has to be part, like the a priori, right, commitment when we are talking about solidarity and anti-racism.
So, I was really struck by that in the slides too. It sounds like you said something like, how does solidarity across the generations commit to dismantling anti-Black racism, right? The way you were phrasing it, it made me, my question was, it sounds like anti-Black racism or targeting it or to like dismantling it, doing away with it, seems really central to solidarity. Was I picking up on that properly?
Absolutely.
Okay. And so if we're in that space, well, I'm going to flip the questions here a little bit because our third question was going to be about this, but since we're in the space, Will, I'm going to come to you and ask about how actually does white supremacy function as a barrier to racial solidarity, especially among communities of color? I think Deepa already started us there, but why don't we stay there, right, before we move on to the other pieces?
Thank you, Carlton. That's a very great question, deep question too. So I'm gonna try not to be too professorial here and go broad. But one of the things I think is important for us to add into this discussion, especially when we start talking about the ways in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness function as a wedge, against our efforts toward solidarity, is the importance of really considering racial capitalism as a part of this overall sort of collective of forms of oppression. So, if I might say that, if white supremacy were a unitary oppressive force, and that was the only thing we had to work against, it actually, in my mind, could be fairly easily dismantled because it's a singular force that you could identify, you could create boundaries around. The racial capitalism piece is really important and the anti-Blackness piece is also critically important because that is where the incentives and the rewards are built into, as Deepa was talking about, to seduce and to reward people of color to engage in white supremacy and anti-Blackness, right? And in an institution like higher education and other organizations, the outcome of that participation in anti-Blackness and white supremacy and the rewards that you get from it is positionality within an organization, within an institution, right? And so it's what I would consider to be proxy privileges. In other words, these are privileges and power that are contingent upon a specific white space with specific white people that are limited in a particular actually geographic area, and also time limited as well. And what that means is that it compels the person of color to constantly be active and working and trying to see that that they're earning their privileges, right? This is the thing that people of color talk about, is I earned my privileges, which is a completely different thing than racial privileges. So what I mean by it, and the important part here is that these proxy privileges are space limited. So for instance, as an Asian American man who's a department chair and a professor, once I walk out of my building, I'm Asian dude, I'm Chinese dude, I'm perpetual foreigner dude, whatever it is, because I'm treated as a racialized person. I don't carry those things with me, that label, that identity, the power that I have in a particular building. Now, you could also make the argument that a white person who's a lead administrator also, people won't recognize that person outside of that space as well. The big difference is they're treated as white. And we underestimate the importance and the power that comes from being treated as white, and the accessibility and the structural advantages that come with being white. And the structural advantages simply means being able to move through white spaces unharassed. And if you're a person of color, you understand how deleterious, how much effort, how much time, how much energy it takes to exist in white space, in white spaces. And to be able to say that when you get home, you know that your body's been dealing with, because you just sort of let it go, right? And you know that your body's been amped up and ramped up dealing with racism that is not a direct threat, it's not a direct assault, but it really is the aggregation, the aggregate feeling of racism within a space. Does that make sense? In other words, one of the things I might ask a class is, tell me about a space that you feel is racist. And it's a place that you've never experienced direct racism, but it's a place that you feel like it's racist. Most people of color can identify lots of places, right? And they also register it within their body, because when they move in and out of those spaces, they feel their body calibrate as a part of it. So, and so for us, when we think about anti-racism, solidarity work, what do we need to do with each other in terms of fighting white supremacy? We really also have to in some ways change the paradigm of how we think about racism and how it operates in our society and operates within our institutions, but also looking within to the individuals within our organizations who benefit from practicing anti-Blackness and white supremacy, and the ways in which they maintain their positionality as a result of it. And those are difficult conversations. I mean, that is truly a difficult dialogue, right? That's the difficult conversations that we need to get to in terms of understanding the ways in which our anti-racism practices are constantly diluted, diverted, delayed as a result of people who practice anti-Blackness in front of us. So let me just stop there. Well, I think you're on mute.
Your mic is muted.
I'm just talking. Thank you. I hear these two things again, right? Or I hear two things. White supremacy culture exhausts us, right? To the degree that we experience that physiologically, psychologically in our bodies, which keeps us from being able to actually do the work of dismantling white supremacy culture and anti-Blackness. But I also hear you saying very adeptly that white supremacy culture dangles rewards or positionality or benefits in front of some of us, and we pursue those at the detriment of sort of like our community being united or our community being able to move together in solidarity, really, right? Because of the associated rewards that come. So I really appreciate that, highlighting those pieces as well. I saw both Nancy and Deepa nodding their heads as you were talking. I don't know if you want to join Will in offering some of your perspective about what he's sharing. How about we come to Nancy first?
I was nodding because I mean, it was just absolutely amazing and brilliant. And I was thinking also about, just to add, really, I would talk about the burden of exceptionalism, right? This notion that for communities of color or people of color, and I see this with the DACA students every time, I always, when I deal with DACA or Dreamers, I'm like, it's okay to be mediocre. You don't have to be like, at Yale and win the MacArthur and all this stuff to justify your soul and your being. And there's a way that communities of color, for us to have any way of entree, not only are we dangled these ideas, and that dangling takes, so smart, it takes so many ways that we could think about it, but it's also the exceptional model that is such a burden to our students that I don't see with white students. And I think this is something that white supremacy does. One of the things that I would add to the conversation, because it's such a vibrant, generative conversation, is that one of the things that white supremacy does, and the only reason I was thinking about this, as I was saying earlier, is that I had been working with Teaching for Change around teaching Reconstruction on a grassroots level to high school students. And there's also a film that's just come out about the multiple different narratives of whiteness and Confederate soldiers, is that white supremacy, in addition to everything that everyone has said, also feeds off of the innocence. It feeds off of denial. It feeds off a constant narrative that is not true, that, allows white folks to not be accountable for their actions historically. And I think that, one of the things that I've always been fascinated as a historian is how many gaps there are in our history, even though we know we exist. And then also how that history has been manipulated to always be at the service of white supremacy and the white narrative. And so I just, was thinking to myself, every time I do this work, or I'm in a classroom, or I'm writing, I just always feel like, at what point do we, and maybe this is something we can think about, begin to make white supremacy accountable, whiteness accountable, ask them, why do you believe that? Why do you think that? What are your historical reasons for thinking this? And I'll just leave that, this kind of question where we're always put in a position to justify our existence, our history, everything. In many ways, I was kind of dealt that hand when I taught an I course for the University of Maryland. So I'll bring in some practical. And the way that I thought that I could teach that course without having to constantly justify these histories and the fact that these things actually took place was to teach a course based on laws and policies and legal policy, so that I could teach, for instance, racism through the Dred Scott case, or I could teach whiteness through the Naturalization Act of 1790, or I could teach these things through these policies and laws, whether it's the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Dawes Act and the Homestead Act, and all of these laws and policies, because I knew that I was going to get questions asking me, or pretty much telling me, that what my vision or what my narrative is not true. And so, when I do things in that regard, when I say, okay, here's a policy and law, why did this happen? What are the historical reasons for this happening? And you have white students respond to it. I think that becomes a powerful way for them to talk about it. And also, one thing that I would add is problematizing whiteness. I mean, this notion that whiteness is somehow a normative that we should all feed into and be a part of, and feel good that we should be a part of it. And I often start in all of my classes with this one saying, and it can be provocative, but I've been saying it for over 20 years, is that the United States has never been a white country. It just never has been. It's been a country that has spent most of its years trying to be white, right? And so we can see that kind of anxiety, even with census data, or this notion that, or the questions around the border, or this idea that there's majority minority, anything where whiteness could be destabilized leads to what we're experiencing now, which is domestic terrorism, white violence, these responses. And what is a response to this violence, this white violence, this terrorism? It's nothing. It's almost like something that we as people of color should accept, because that's how it's always been. So, I think on some level, in having these conversations, it's really important for us to begin to demand of white supremacy and whiteness, for them to change, not for us to always to change.
Go ahead, Deepa.
Yeah, I mean, this is just such a great conversation. I'm so grateful for this space. I would just add, I would add one thing and then maybe pose a question for us to think about as well. But the one thing that I think both of you have talked about so much is that there is this existence of a racial ladder in this country, a racial hierarchy in this country, clearly, right? Where whiteness is at the top and anti-Blackness is at the bottom. And I think what solidarity requires us to do is to recognize and to decline what is often called the racial bribe that is given and, as William said, dangled right out to other communities of color, particularly non-Black communities of color. So we really have to decline that bribe, recognize where it comes from, and we have to dismantle the racial ladder together, right? But within that, and this is, I guess, a bridge to something else, I think it's important that white folks don't get a pass when it comes to dismantling the racial ladder, right? White folks don't get to be bystanders. And so what I often find, and, this is like, in out there in the world or on campus, often find that a lot of white folks are woke to what is happening in our country and around the world. They're very respectful. They recognize their privileges. They show up, when they need to. But I think that the challenge for white folks is to actually go further than that, right? And that's why I often say, well, it's great that you're an upstander, but or an ally, but what does it mean for you to be a co-conspirator, right? Which means that you have a stake in these issues too, which means that when there is a campaign, say, for, divesting from law enforcement and investing in mental health services, for example, right? That's not just an issue for Black communities or for communities of color. What is your stake in that? What's your stake? What's your community's stake in that? And that then means that there is more of an incentive to get involved in the campaign and in the cause, right? Because you see how it affects you, your communities. And for co-conspirators, it means that you understand the stake, and then you actually utilize your power, positionality, and privilege to intervene in some way. So that could mean, for example, that you might have some relationships or contacts with people in power that you pass on to the communities that are most affected, right? It happens in lots of different ways when we exercise our power and positionality. But I think that that's all of us. It's not just on people of color to dismantle the racial hierarchy. It requires all of us to do so.
Thank you all for that. I was thinking about, y'all are already moving into sort of like sharing practical things that people can be thinking about doing, but the piece that Nancy put on the table about white supremacy culture not demanding accountability, right? Thinking specifically, I was trying to think about how to make that practical for our campus. If we think about the fact that there are Black, brown, trans, queer, women, folks who are saying I'm being harassed, I'm being stalked, there's discrimination that's occurring against me. One of the things that often happens is that those who are often part of dominant group populations who commit those egregious types of crimes and bias acts, we don't hold them accountable, right? We just don't think in terms of what accountability could look like for them. We will oftentimes say, well, let's get this person some help. Let's send them to the counseling center. Let's get them some support because of what it is that they've been, what they've gone through. But we don't think in terms of like, no, what would it look like to actually practice accountability in this community? And white supremacy has written us a script or a narrative or procedures that just don't do that. Even if I think about staff, who might complain about working with a supervisor who might be racist or something like that. We don't think about it holding those folks accountable. We think about maybe moving the staff person or getting them some mental health support or doing something that doesn't actually address the problem. So that piece about, I hope that folks are hearing that white supremacy culture actually fosters a culture that lacks accountability for folks on campus, right? Kind of moving to the next question. This is for Nancy. How does white supremacy, how does your work promote solidarity, or what have you learned about doing solidarity work in your career? And we'll certainly open that up for Will and Deepa as well.
Well, I did mention a little bit about my teaching. So I think for me, solidarity work, and I love Deepa's point about it being transformative. I think absolutely. I think that solidarity work, at the same time that it's life-saving and life-giving, it's also very dangerous, right? And I think about, as I said before, one of my favorite quotes is Fred Hampton's quote, which I have it here because I have it framed. And I always remind myself that when I do my work, that this is what it's really about. You know, we say we will work with anybody and form a coalition with anybody who has revolution on their mind. And I think that that's also what has really kind of, and I can put it in the chat, always inspired me, which is when we come together in a transformative way to do this work, we make revolutionary change. We get results. And that's where the fear comes from. And there's these moments in history, whether I was talking about a film on the Rainbow Coalition, whether it's, you know, the Young Lords working with the Black Panther Party and other organizations coming together, or to just get bread and butter issues. I think that is what led to Fred Hampton being killed. And there's these moments. We know, for instance, when Martin Luther King kind of pivoted and said, look, I'm going to work towards anti-poverty. I'm going to work with other organizations. I'm going to protest against the Vietnam War, and I'm going to create these coalitions and these solidarity movements. That's when things got very difficult. And even in our memory, right, when we think even about Martin Luther King, those are elements of his legacy that we somehow leave out because it is very uncomfortable to capitalism, to racial capitalism, to whiteness. So that's why I say that solidarity work is necessary, it's key. And part of that is for us as people who are invested in that to not get, as William was saying, to get distracted by the colonizing trick of whiteness, right? By this idea that somehow whiteness wants to polarize us, whiteness wants to always, and this is something that happens in the Latinx community a great deal, always having to be obsessed with identity. Who are we, to the point where we're kind of going in our minds about whether we're worthy to do this solidarity work. And I say to people, you're worthy. If you believe in it, if you want to get to a result, you're worthy and we need you. So I think that's where, a lot of my work, I've been someone that, I will work into welfare rights. I will go into grassroots organization, Teaching for Change. I will go wherever it is that I see positive, transformative, to use Deepa's, solidarity and change coming through. And I think that if we can create two things. One, a language where we allow ourselves to see that and see that there's some historical precedence for this work, this positive work. And also to understand when whiteness and white supremacy is doing, I think this, is doing this work of separation and exclusion. And I think oftentimes of making us feel even unworthy to do this work when we should be doing this work. So those are, and this is a lifelong kind of learning. But I do see that if anything positive comes out of the last 4 years of the last president, that who he will not be named, is that we have come together and said, we must come together because we have some real issues and problems facing us. And the only way to really change it is for us to really come together and work together.
Mm-hmm. Somebody just dropped something to the chat that's kind of following up on that. Nancy, you're talking about coming together, but the person put in, can the panelists talk about a time that they were in solidarity with other communities, and then you had to put aside your own desires or your own wants, or so like your own priorities in order to be able to be in coalition or in collaboration with other communities? Does anything come to mind for anybody?
Well, I think just as a small example, being in solidarity with, let's say, 2 summers ago, when we had sort of this global movement for Black Lives Matter. And there was among some Asian American communities a need to sort of equalize, to see themselves at the same level, right? To sort of flatten. I think Deepa had mentioned this, to conflate, to flatten everything together, saying we're all experiencing the same thing. And so it's a very difficult conversation to have within the Asian American community, because, and I think we did a presentation on this, which is to say, we experience things, but they're different. And we are also positioned differently in the United States. And so we have, it's a different place that we're in and at. And in that regard, we have to focus on what is important and elevate and prioritize and identify and support. And in return, at some point, we know that this will happen with us as well, which is what happened with the anti-Asian hate crimes that happened as well. We had lots of Latinx and Black Lives Matter participants come out and support the work as well. And so trying to have that conversation and remind folks not to flatten everything out, right? To make it seem like we're all experiencing the same thing. I think it's really important. And that was just a quick example with respect to Asian American community.
You're nodding, Deepa. Do you want to add something to that?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I agree that those kinds of things happen. I think that, oftentimes there's this thing of, well, what about me, or me too, or, all lives matter, those kinds of responses. And I think that, so some of it is to be patient, to understand why people have some of those responses. It's because they maybe have not been heard or seen, or they have not ever had their issues be visible. So I think it's important to have some patience and understanding for that. But at the same time, and this is, why, sort of, I said at the beginning, we have to also understand that one of, the poisonous tree, the root of white supremacy, really rests in anti-Black racism. So, and if you have a tree poisoned at its root with anti-Black racism, of course its branches, and of course whatever fruit it bears will also be poisonous, right? And that is why that, again, addressing, confronting, dismantling anti-Black racism has to be part of our strategy if we want to dismantle that racial ladder altogether, or if we want to prevent oppression and discrimination against other people too. Because when, as the movement for Black Lives reminds us time and again, when Black people are free, all people will be free, because that racial ladder will not exist, right? If we don't have it situated the way that it is. So I think that's why it's so important to commit ourselves to ending anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. It makes me think about how we are having more specific conversations about anti-Blackness or about anti-Black racism. And, a lot of scholars really talk about Blackness being this foundational piece to America, because it helps people to think, at least I'm not Black, right? You get to be something else, but you don't get to be Black. And so there's a way that this hierarchy is really built upon Blackness existing. And so how do we do away with, or how do we undo or unlearn, right, this really problematic perception of what Blackness is in this country? Yeah, thank you for that. I'm looking at the time. We don't have much time left, right? If you were wanting to share with people, right, something that they could do, thinking about our students, faculty, and staff, that they could do when it comes to beginning to engage in solidarity work, what would you want people to be walking away with, maybe as a first step? Deepa, do you want to start us there?
I can try. Because a couple of thoughts I would have is, if we have some level of ability to structure classes, right? If we're actually teaching or involved in some way with students in that way, the importance of bringing in inclusive histories and experiences, I think, is critical. It doesn't matter what kind of class you teach, right? We know that racism is pervasive. So how do you actually talk about racism? How do you bring in histories and experiences of other communities? How do you tie things to news hooks? I think that's something that should be our responsibility, because we don't live in a vacuum. Our students don't live in a bubble. I think a second piece is to actually really strengthen student organizations and student organizing. And so how can there be more spaces and places for students to convene, for students to be in generative tension, addressing issues with each other, ideas with each other, right? I mean, we know that so much of the movements for ethnic studies around the country came from students engaging on college campuses. And so how do we create more of those spaces? How do we strengthen them? How do we strengthen the analysis of young people to be able to engage in social movements on their campuses and beyond? And then I think a third piece would be that, solidarity particularly can't just be sort of a statement that we send out, whether we're an institution or an organization. Anytime something horrific happens, right? We have to really make sure that that statement is backed up with staffing, practices, policies that show us in real life what it means. So specificity in terms of when we put out a statement, the more specific we can be as to what that means for us and our student body, faculty, staff, that's also really critical as well.
Thank you. Who would like to go next? Nancy, you ready?
I don't know if I could add to what Deepa said. It was pretty complete. I think that the only thing that I could add to that would be to have more conversations like the one we're having, Carlton. I mean, this was an amazing conversation, and I think that it's something that we should have more of them. Maybe create spaces where we can talk about racism as a system, what solidarity looks like. All of these things, I think, can add to making this actually much more feasible and practical. So that's the only thing that I would add, is it's not just do it once a year, but to maybe do it more often and to commit to it.
Yeah, I actually hear you. The way that I'm hearing that is to stop looking away, right? How is it that you disconnect from sort of like the gaze that wants to look away from the racism conversation, but how do you actually pay attention and join in the conversation about oppression? Yeah, thank you. What about you, Will?
I think it's really important that when we think about people in positions of power, it's critical that we support those people who are putting words to the criticality that we need to understand racism, anti-racism work, white supremacy, to support and elevate, to prioritize them, to highlight them, and to, in many ways, also to protect them as well. I think if we really want to and believe in the work that we're doing, then we also have to, for instance, in my role as a department chair, really look for and protect those people who are doing this really critical work, because they're so vulnerable, so susceptible to being exploited, being erased, being silenced in many different ways, from within and also from outside the community as well. So I think that's really substantial in terms of what we want to do. And it works in counter to, against this idea of racial capitalism, because racial capitalism, when you get a position in the university, for instance, we often are closing doors behind us. We're not opening doors and elevating. Racial capitalism doesn't work that way. We close doors behind us because we don't want the competition. That's how it operates. So in contrast, we really want to be mindful of that and pull people along and support. I think it's really important that we do that work if we believe in it. And I think that's the piece that we have to do when we're in positions of power, with whatever power that we have. I think it's really critically important, because I understand it as a very transient place that I'm at. And I have to do as much as I can with it and to support those people who are working alongside. So
Yeah. If we go back to the beginning of the conversation where we were talking about white supremacy dangling benefits in front of people, I hear you really saying that a part of the strategy has to become, especially for those of us who have power, right, or people who hold positions of power, you have to be careful about how it is that we've been socialized into white supremacy culture to value those carrots and to not close the doors on the people that we could be inviting into the room, or to not close the doors on people so that we could then turn around and share our gifts and our skills and our wisdom, right, about how it is that we are working in the context of these systems, right? But white supremacy culture or white supremacy will try to convince us that we don't need to be doing that. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think I'll just end it here. White supremacy culture, in terms of the privileges that it affords people of color within certain organizations, expects us to be racially innocuous. In other words, to be quiet, to be silent, and to placate to the white audience. And I think that's the piece that we really have to be careful of, because if we want to retain our positions of power, we start to silence ourselves. And that's how we close the doors behind us. We start to silence other people as well, because the audience is not the group that we're trying to help thrive. The audience is the people who are giving us the power, right? That's as Derek Bell talks about, is interest convergence, highly seductive, highly powerful, really a great source, important source of creating division. So I'll just end it there. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Thank you, Deepa. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Nancy, for this conversation. We hope that people were able to glean some really important understanding about what solidarity is, in addition to really thinking about how it is that maybe they can begin to change their practice when it comes to being in solidarity across campus and within our community. Thank you all so much today.